Our next panel is called Crossing Borders, International Dynamics and Influences on Gene Editing in Society. So from biodiversity and ag trade to innovation in human gene editing, we all have heard over the past day and a half that CRISPR raises important questions, and those questions include the borders of biotechnology. This panel in particular is going to explore the challenges and opportunities in coordination, collaboration, and governance for gene editing across nations and cultures and across a variety of applications. And we're so honored to have this panel lineup, which really includes leaders in their field from a variety of fields, whether it's in agriculture, biotech, and trade and policy, or health sciences, or conservation, or just international governance in general. Each of our panelists bring crucial expertise, and I'm also honored to introduce our moderator, Gideon Rose, himself an expert on foreign affairs, being as he is the editor of Foreign Affairs since 2010. And he's been at the magazine since 2000. Prior to that, he was Deputy Director of Security Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. He also served as an Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. So we thank Gideon as our moderator, and all of our panelists. We'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves in a little more depth. And a reminder, once again, all of our biographies are posted at CRISPRcon.org if you want to dive in. So welcome to our panel. We'll get them set up, and we'll dive right in.
So let's see. We can so thank you very much. We have a spectacular panel today. We all know that the international dimension of the gene editing question in terms of the regulation, in terms of the uneven way in which a global enterprise of science maps onto the patchwork of states and international regulations and so forth. It's not a particularly easy or fun bit of sausage making to look at, but it's crucially important. And you might say, why is somebody from foreign affairs who's not a scientist getting involved in this kind of thing? This is actually, from a broader perspective, a fairly common type of problem in which there isn't actually an international ability to essentially provide collective action and regulation for a common problem, regardless of the details of that problem. How do we map this onto a variety of things? We're seeing this in a bunch of areas, from nuclear proliferation to economic activity and sanctions and so forth. So how do we actually move forward and liberate the benefits of gene editing for humanity and yet control its worst consequences and potential nightmares? We have an extraordinarily impressive panel today to address those issues and talk with us about the international dimensions, or the different national dimensions is also another way of putting it. We're going to start with Chen Pei. Dr. Pei from the Guangzhou Institutes of Biomedicine and Health will bring a Chinese perspective. Then Fanli Chao from the U.S. Department of Agriculture will talk. I was just watching that slide with her about the regulation, and she was fascinated to see the diversity of views on agricultural regulations. Manuela Pessoa de Miranda from the Convention on Biological Diversity will talk. And then Sheila Jasanoff from Harvard University, who studied these issues from an academic perspective and the history of science, will bring some perspective. And we're very fortunate. And so for that, Chen Pei, Dr. Pei, to you. You can sit here.
Yeah. So my name is Chen Pei. I'm from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I'm a stem cell biologist, so that's what I do. I also am the Director General of the Institute, so it's a 800+ member institute. So in addition to being sort of a stem cell driven kind of enterprise for the Institute, just over the last couple of years, I've been involved in gene editing. I serve on the 2015 International Summit, and I have been involved in gene editing sort of policy, science, society for the last 2 years or so.
Good morning. My name is Fanli Chao. I'm here representing the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but actually a very small part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'm the biotechnology coordinator, which is a very innocuous sounding title. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I do, and then I'll tell you about why I am doing what I do. What I do is to work across U.S. Department of Agriculture. We have very different mission areas that work on biotechnology, and I work with the political leadership in figuring out how we can be as coordinated and as collaborative as we can across the USDA. In addition, we think about how we can be collaborative across the US government as a whole. As you all know, agriculture is a very important component of the domestic economics of the United States. It's also a very important export. We are a net exporter in agriculture. So for us, the international component is very important because we need a market for what we grow in this country. But that's, in a nutshell, that is what I do. Well, why do I do what I do? I love my job. I've been with the USDA for almost 13 years. I am a scientist, and to borrow Kevin's phrase, I'm a techno-optimist. But full disclosure, I am not an agricultural scientist. I'm a learner in agriculture. So, and I think to borrow our adjunct speaker, we need more scientists doing different things. So I'm a human geneticist that's doing agriculture. So I came into that space kind of sideways through the AAAS program for science policy fellowships. So I'm one of these scientists that wasn't really great, wonderful at the bench. So I wanted to do something different, and that's how I got into agriculture. So before that, my interaction with agriculture, like most of the folks that live in Boston, is at the grocery store. I go and I buy food, right? So in that way, the last 13 years with USDA has been a tremendous learning opportunity for me to think about how, as a consumer, my actions has impact all the way down the line, right? To understand how we get what we get at the supermarkets. Is it from US farmers? Is it from Thailand? Is it from Mexico? And how that's all interconnected and how we get what we get, right? So that's, to me, I really fell in love with agriculture, with USDA. The people are wonderful. I don't know what you think about federal workers, but we are a dedicated bunch. Also, I'm a mom, so I care about what I feed my kids. My kids are 6 and 3. Sometimes they just want to eat mac and cheese. They're very traditional American kids. So I care about what I feed them. They want to eat strawberries in December, blueberries in January. I have to be able to provide that. And I also care about what's going to happen to the environment. They are the future, right? To borrow from Whitney Houston. So you had to think about that. So I care about the environment. So I think for my job, this is where all of the different hats we wear, the interconnects, right? So I feel that my job, at USDA is to try to create an environment where we are providing as many tools to our farmers. Help develop these tools, because we have research in USDA as well. And then to find markets so that folks, not just folks in the US, but folks around the world have access, I think, to both affordable and safe food. And that is I think the majority of the goal for US farmers, for folks that are involved in the agricultural space.
Excellent, thank you. Manuela Pessoa de Miranda, how do you think let's talk about the existing conventions on biological diversity, or just talk about how the international structure of governance you think is appropriate or not appropriate for the challenges we face in this area.
Sure. Hi, I'm Manuela Miranda. I know my name is a mouthful. So I've been working at the Convention on Biological Diversity for the last 10 years. Some of you know it as the Biodiversity Convention, or simply the CBD. The CBD sets the tone, or governments discuss and set the tone for actions to take on environmental conservation, sustainable use, and the sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. It's a pretty global agreement. There are 192 parties to the convention, 196, excuse me, to the convention. Only the US and the Vatican are not parties. That doesn't mean, however, that the US is not a key player. The US is always in our meetings and a big partner. But we also, in addition to working with governments, to national governments, we work with a lot of what we've been hearing since yesterday here. We work with local communities. We work with indigenous peoples, academia, NGOs, the industry, of course. So it's a very complex and dynamic environment where we try and I heard that from Dave from Campbell Soup yesterday, we can't make everyone happy, but we sure listen to everyone. That's our main goal, at least. And we digest all those views and provide those to governments. We put forward those views to governments so that governments can take action. Now, the CBD is not directly concerned with health, so a lot of the applications of CRISPR related to health challenges are not within our mandate, if you wish, but we are concerned with much of the applications for conservation and for agricultural purposes. So we also have a protocol under the convention that's called the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety that regulates GMOs, and in particular the import and export of GMOs between countries. And we also have another protocol called the Nagoya Protocol that relates to the sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. And the big discussion now is also very relevant to CRISPR. It is the use of and the sharing of digital sequence information. There's still a discussion whether it's only nucleic acid sequence or protein sequence or other types of information related to genetic resources. So that's something that's going on very recently. And of course, being it an environmental agreement, we are concerned about the potential adverse effects of CRISPR, in particular gene drives. But we also recognize that there is a huge potential to help countries achieve the objectives of the convention by using CRISPR. So we are trying to balance these two different views in a way that's pretty much in line with what we've been discussing here since yesterday, in a way that will we would like to help and shape the research so that that's in line with communities and with indigenous peoples and to the great benefit of, to the global benefit.
Thank you. Dr. Jasanoff, as you look at this in a broader perspective in the history of things, does this, I mean, I thought it was fascinating to see the quotes from previous technological advances and how they're going to change the world and how there's going to be a giant legal fight over this. As you look at these discussions over gene editing now, does this all seem like we've seen this before? How is this like and unlike previous episodes in sort of bringing collective action to bear on the regulation and control of new scientific technologies?
Well, I should begin by saying that right now I feel that if CRISPR could help us deal with the biological diversity of the flu virus, I would be very pleased. But I will try to speak over the receding effects of a flu the last few days. So Gideon, you're obviously right to bring up that historical question because there are aspects of what we're hearing currently that are very reminiscent of the past. So in the I think the first of the lightning talks, there were pictures with all those scissors. Those scissors started appearing in the very earliest days of genetic engineering. The idea that a simple snip could actually bring us the results we want with genetic engineering have been with us since the very earliest days of being able to manipulate the gene in chemical ways. And we've learned that the technology is not as simple as that diagramming of the scissors suggests. And even with CRISPR, with all of its vaunted precision, there is already a fairly well-developed debate on off-target effects and how prevalent those will be and what the meaning will be. But the point is not so much the technical content of these debates as the typology of them. And this is where, following technological controversies, not just, by the way, in the genetics area, but all across the board, nuclear power, for instance, is a fantastic example. You find that where people don't agree on the fundamental purposes and values of using a technology, there they will find ways of quarreling about the facts as well. And we're seeing that dynamic, that people are beginning to disagree about the facts because of, I think, a sort of fundamental lack of attention to what the purposes of using the technology are, and then gradually emerging divergences in that area. So with all due respect, I think techno-optimism is an overly simplified term because we are optimistic about different kinds of things, and different societies are optimistic or pessimistic about different sorts of things, and not enough brush clearing has necessarily been done to create a kind of foundation for the kind of collective action problem that you're pointing to.
Okay, that's actually a wonderful lead-in, Dr. Jasanoff, and I'd like to turn actually to Dr. Pei, because I personally think that there's almost three kinds of issues we deal with in foreign affairs globally in general. There's the issues that sort of people have, the specialists kind of know about, but the rest of the world doesn't, and so getting people to realize this is a big issue, this is a big problem, you should be paying attention to. That's one category. Second category is, okay, now what the hell do we do about this issue, right? And then there's the third category is, okay, we all know what to do about this, but it's blocked for various sort of political reasons, so how do we get rid of the blockages? I mean, think of gun control or the Middle East peace process as being in the last issue, right? We've had the debate, we've had endless debates, we're gridlocked, and the only question is how to move forward. CRISPR, a few years ago, was in the first category. Oh my God, gene editing, for the world at large. Gene editing is coming to everything big. It's all important. What do we do? This is a big new tool. Now we're in the second phase, right? The second, okay, so what? We've had endless conversations about regulation, endless conversations about the problems. How do we move forward? So let's do the brush clearing that Dr. Jasanoff just talked about. And Dr. Pei, let me start with you. China is one of, if not the most important player, then certainly one of the two most important players in these technologies going forward. You are very aware of what's going on there. How is the Chinese perspective on the gene editing question and the regulation question? How do Chinese authorities and Chinese scientists look on that, and is it different from the way their American colleagues might?
So by sheer size, obviously, we represent a large section of humanity. I wish to speak from a sort of a student perspective. I think from all the talks we've been hearing, and CRISPR all of a sudden enable our students in the lab to ask many, many interesting questions. So this is a way of transforming. I think since students, and they will become administrators like me now, they will become professors, they will eventually some of them will become leaders, right? So I think if you look on a time scale of maybe 30 years or 50 years from now, I think they are going to look back, they will pinpoint one single technology, I think maybe CRISPR, and that has sort of transformed the current landscape research-wise. I think that's really, really important in my point of view because this is something never happened before, even for our Chinese students. So I came to this country in 1985, with the aim to learn molecular biology. That was just the beginning. I was so excited to look at, DNA on a gel. I can stain them. I spoke to my son who's doing that in high school. And I actually reminded him that in the future, you don't even have to do it. The machine is going to do that for you. Because the convergence of research, AI, the type of technology in our hands is remarkable. I think CRISPR is just a one occurrence in the continuum of many, many innovations and discoveries we're having. I think this is to echo your optimism, and I think we are in a really remarkable time. I think this is truly remarkable.
But I agree with everything you just said, but I just want to press you on something about that because, so let's take those trends a little bit further, right? So if your son can do in high school what you were doing in graduate school, then what will his daughter be doing in a few years, and what will he doing when he's a full-scale adult professional later on? And will that be able to be regulated? And if what we're talking about is that they're not just upsides but downsides, will the ability of an independent high school student in a lab somewhere 20 years from now be able to affect the future of the human genome?
Yeah, so So that already has been happening. I think I'm very proud of the fact that I was involved and invited to be the first international summit on human gene editing. And that's an effort by the three academies, the US Academy of Sciences, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and the Royal Society from Britain. And from a academic angle, how, because this started out in science, and the scientists and scientific organization already started the whole process of what we call self-regulating. And therefore, because this is so new, and there's so many things we don't know, and if you really say, let's set up some sort of very strict guideline, that might stifle innovation, because we still have many, many things we need to know. And on the other hand, it's such great potential, and you don't pay attention to it, and then it may run out of control. So that's why I use the student paradigm, because we're in a learning mode, and all of us, and it's not only the scientists. I think the government will begin to pay attention, and now in the industry, CRISPRcon is a great forum. And I'm also very happy to let you know, and many of you already know, we're going to have the second summit in Hong Kong in November. So I hope many of you will come. And we'll be debating many, many of the issues, and as we probably discuss in this case.
Excellent. Manuela, you talked about what you guys were doing and what are the areas, as you look at things like gene editing, what are the areas that are unregulated, that there are no actual bodies in being to deal with effectively? And will we ever get there? Because even you would say, I think, that the kind of organizations you're involved with now are not geared towards dealing with the international regulation of germline editing, for example. So who will be doing all that, and what are the international institutions that don't yet exist that we need to deal with the problem? Or do we need it, but just need greater cooperation inside existing ones?
Before I answer that, if you allow me, I'd just like to make a comment on what was said before about regulation. There are two ways that we can look at regulations. We can look at regulations, like you rightly said, that are excessive and that slow down innovation, or we can look at regulations as enabling measures that will help public acceptance. So it's where we are and where countries are that will dictate where that needle is. So I think we need also a shift in thinking of regulations as enabling measures that will bring to a different outcome of what happened to GMOs. So back to your question, we, as in the CBD, we do not deal with germline research, but there are other organizations in the UN, such as the WHO, the World Health Organization, that does. So there is a lot of work going on at the international level that covers pretty much all different aspects of gene editing. One of the questions, perhaps, is the different products. So they're not the living organisms anymore, but the products of gene editing, and what regulatory systems would be able to address those issues and whether there are gaps. So this is an area where people are still discussing, because the regulations with regards to products is quite fragmented. So there are chemical regulations, there are biological weapons regulations, which are in this case living in most cases, but not always. So this is still a big question mark, but I would say that for most applications of CRISPR, there is already at least an international framework and a regulatory framework in most countries at the national level to take care. And they may need to be adapted, though.
Dr. Zhou, so Miranda said something that, Manuela said something that you hear a lot. Oh my God, we have to make sure that CRISPR doesn't go the way of GMO. That the GMO debate was a disaster. Everybody seems to feel that the GMO, the public perception of GMOs and the public debate and the regulatory was a giant disaster that needs to be handled better and differently for CRISPR so that the benefits of gene editing don't get stigmatized. How or why is the regulatory environment for things like agriculture or the different US and European views over things like editing, how is that going to avoid, how are we going to avoid going into the GMO wars over CRISPR?
I'll back up a little bit, right? So I think from a perspective of talking about regulation, and there's been a lot of conversation of regulation, we need to kind of think about why do we regulate? What's the purpose of regulation? Right? If you do not want something to happen, there's no need for regulation, just ban it, right? The purpose of regulation is put into a place, a system that actually will allow safe products to come into the marketplace. And how you design that regulation or governance in a broader sense is, I think Sheila would talk about, there's different ways and different thoughts about how to do that. And I'm not saying that we did it the best way we could. And I think whether GMO was a disaster or not disaster, you can look at it from varying different perspectives. I think for many of our farmers that are using GM crops, it totally was not a disaster. If you look at our export market, it's on total not a complete disaster, right? So from a regulatory perspective, if you look at the European market, they're one of the biggest importers of GM soybeans, right? So it's about what they intend to use it, and I think you have to kind of take a pretty honest look of what's happening around the world. But I think on the GE crop front, I'm trying to be precise in my language, the transgenic crop side, we are, if you look at who's growing, who's exporting, who's importing, it's kind of a two-sided, right? The Western Hemisphere is growing, Brazil, Canada, Argentina, the US, and the rest of the world are importing, right? And if you look at the research, because of the regulatory framework, and this is maybe an unintended consequence, is most of the research is happening where there is more a allowing environment or more of an enabling environment. So all the research on transgenic is moving out of Europe into the United States, into Brazil, into Argentina. So, but if you look at the research of genome editing, that's different. It's a completely different landscape. China on the crop side is a huge, huge source of innovation on the R&D side, right? So whether that becomes commercially available, is that the products, that remains to be seen. There's lots of, I think, factors of whether that's going to happen or not, right? So if you look at Japan, they're doing a lot of research. And if you look at, we talk about GM, we're just talking about crops, right? So this technology, transgenic technology, has been completely not leveraged in the animal production side. And we can talk about the pros and cons of that. So on the animal side, we see a lot of application of gene editing as well that is very different than on the plant side. It's looking at animal welfare. And when I came to USDA, I was all plants. Now I'm learning more about animals. And there's a lot of things about animal production that I didn't know about as a person that just go buy chicken breast wrapped in cellophane. So I think we have to learn about all these different applications, and there's different players, so the conversation is different, the international environment is different about, are the Europeans against this technology? If you ask their seed industry, if you ask their pork industry, the answer is like, how do we get these tools so we can use them, right? So how can regulation be an enabling tool instead of a prohibiting tool? I think that's a really interesting question.
Great. Dr. Jasanoff, so let me turn to you for a second. When I mentioned the GMO disaster, I guess what I meant was the failure by scientific and other elites during the rollout of a new technology to prepare the public for it, such that when it became popularly known, so many people reacted crazily against it that you end up getting a popular campaign with a lot of anti-science garbage that has captured a whole lot of society and young people simply because the understanding of what was going on was never handled properly. And therefore a whole kind of problem, which yes, there's a lot of commercial technology stuff, but almost every young person now wants something that is GMO free because they don't understand what they're actually even talking about. And if gene editing goes that way, if CRISPR goes that way, it's actually a pretty big problem, I think. At least most of the people in industry, I feel, want to avoid that kind of divide in which CRISPR becomes a label you have to run away from rather than embrace. So I guess my question to you is, do you see any possibility that the rollout for something like the advances in gene editing due to CRISPR will be able not to be as controversial as the rollout for things of such like GMO stuff?
So of course, this could be a provocative question because I could disagree with every single premise in what you've just asked.
That would be one, if you, all the better, all the better. This is an intellectual forum, and
So,
the fact is we need to actually.
it always bothers me a bit that we
right
live in these things called democracies that we supposedly cherish, and then when it comes to science and technology and people don't seem to want those things, like nuclear power plants, for instance, then we suddenly concoct a view of democracy that says that the poor demos, they don't know anything, they don't understand anything. I mean, this is the same demos to which we give these drug package inserts with small type, and we expect them to be able to read all these things and know exactly how to dose them. So, I mean, in the biomedical context, we certainly load a lot onto these very consumers who suddenly, when it comes to GMO resistance or vaccination resistance, turn out to be these complete idiots who have not been brought along by the public. And when the debate, furthermore, is between Europe and the US, what exactly are we claiming? That all the literate people are in the US and all the illiterate people are in Europe? I mean, there's not even very good survey data to back up such a contention. So, if one looks historically, the American science and industry complex, such as it is around biotechnology, got everything it was asking for in the period from approximately 1975 to approximately 1984. 75 was the Asilomar Conference, which was conceived as another of these science-led summits. And 1984 was the adoption of the Coordinated Framework for Regulating Biotechnology, which essentially said, we don't need new legislation. We can do it all through existing restrictions on products that we already have. Well, set aside whether there's a legal matter that was a good idea or a bad idea, what that bypassed was any serious public discussion. So one could actually look at this so-called disaster as the world talking back and saying, sorry, we did not think that Asilomar in 1975 was an adequate global debate. When we say global, you talked, Gideon, about the Middle East and about other intransigent problems in the world where we've been debating and debating for a long time. Difficult issues just take a while to consolidate around. But if you bypass them totally, and if you say that, for instance, the three national scientific academies that are organizing the summit are doing an adequately good job, I mean, it doesn't take much Democracy Theory 101 to say, isn't this the fox guarding the chicken coop? Why should we let the three leading science bodies in the world, where every single scientist has commercial interests to boot, decide for the globe at large what they should be wanting? And then if people turn around and say, sorry, we have problems, then surely we should listen to why they have problems and not say they're not getting the science.
Excellent. Perfect. And therefore, we should do what? Who should do what to address the democratic deficit that you just identified?
Well, the science academies, to begin with, should curtail the ways in which they advertise what it is they're doing. I think it's totally fine for elite scientific bodies to be talking to each other. I think there's plenty of stuff that needs to be sorted out in the science. But to call something a summit, a term borrowed from global diplomacy, suggests that it's about something else. And it's not about something else. If it were about something else, then David Baltimore would not be the co-chair of both the first summit and the second summit. There's a way to say that if you want to think about bioethics, if you want to think about the history of technological controversy, if you want to think about global inequality or disparities, if you want to think about hunger as a real problem versus biodiversity as a real problem, if you want to think about farmers owning land in 1 hectare lots versus huge agribusiness in the American Midwest and think that this is a structural issue that has to be factored into what kinds of technologies ought to be used or ought not to be used. If you're thinking about expanding into Africa, what is Africa and what are its nutritional needs? And is the fact that we can do salmon or we can do soybeans an adequate rationale for saying export these technologies into the thing called Africa that doesn't even exist because it's such a disparate continent? Okay, so if, what are the issues? If the issues are the complex set of issues, then it's also rather clear who ought to be involved. You start in different places. You start with the global organizations that Manuela spoke about, because under the heading of the United Nations, you mentioned the WHO, but there are also already existing conventions under the leadership of UNESCO, and the CBD, of course, is itself such an organization. Those are some places to begin. Another model that's not often talked about is the European Union itself, which has within it a great deal of variation. And they have had disparate ideas. Britain is far more receptive to GMOs than Austria is. Austria is like, say no to all of it. But it's partly because they have a really powerful organics lobby and organics industry that is important to them. And they also happen to love the idea of organics. Now, we also have created this market in organics, which, as you know, has grown and grown side by side with the GMO industry. And, we might start asking ourselves what our consumers want, and not, for instance, block labeling attempts on the misguided theory that consumers don't understand the technology, when consumers may be saying, we understand it perfectly well. We just want to be told how our food is being grown.
Wow, there's a lot to talk about in there, by the way. I'm going to be digesting that a lot. No, you're going to be hearing about this in Foreign Affairs, because you're going to be writing about this in Foreign Affairs eventually, so we'll see. We'll talk about this. But so let me take a slight shift, because there's a lot of different angles to this question. But there's, in something like nuclear proliferation, there are two different types of issues that we worry about. There's what states do with their nuclear programs, right, and getting international treaties to regulate the states and have state-to-state conventions and agreements and arms control stuff. And then there's the sort of things you do to make sure that only states actually have it and that non-state actors and individuals don't get it. And sort of what you do to prevent weapons from going into the hands of an Osama bin Laden is different from the question of, US and China arms control. And so I guess shifting for a second, to the question not of what will big national academies do in their reports or what will the international conventions be that will get there, but whatever those things get done, whatever the agreements are, whatever that are worked out between the EU and the US and the international bodies and so forth, will any of that actually be able to control this field, given what we talked about before, which is the individual ability of local small-scale science and democratized science to do things, and given the ability of this particular technology to go into the wild and then basically get it over. So will all the things we're talking about end up being overturned by the actions of a few super-empowered individuals? I guess that's a question to all of you to a second. I'm curious, but to you as well.
Yes, I'd like to just respond to Sheila's comment about the academies. First of all, the point are well taken, obviously, and just want to remind everybody that I think it's to the credit of the academies to take the initiative in the beginning to start a dialogue. Obviously, there are a lot of debate within China whether that should be called a summit or summit, because summit is meant differently to different people. But I think my overall experience with the whole process is very positive for myself, because I learned a lot. How a issue like CRISPR is viewed from different cultural background. And from a scientific background, from a scientific angle, it's very simple, right? I mean, if you talk to equality, inequality, there's what this can do on a germline level to our future, And all we know, the genome is very robust. And now we're going to perturb them. We're going to probe them, probe our genome in such a grand scale. I think those are something really we have to just in the beginning phase of that. So I think to really bring everything together, I think we have to learn a lot before we say what's the needle is going to be. I think we have to really measure many of those aspects. I think since the summit, and then there were the study, and the study released a report, and the report actually set very clear guidelines on heritable editing, and also the one preceding that are the somatic and therapeutic. And in a way, I think that has been positive in a way. At least people can throw that at them too, criticize. And that's also why we have a second and also the continuing. And also in the periphery, and there are many, I have been invited into many forums. Thanks to the organizer also for me to be part of this panel as well. I went to Europe. I went to many different forums on gene editing. I got exposed to many different views. So I am sort of taking this back into my own country and discuss them. I think one way to go. I think sooner or later, this information will be disseminated to many important decision makers. I think there ought to be some sort of agreement. I think I'm very hopeful that we can really come together, as the poll was really showing. Cooperativity, is 9-1, right? So that's I think if you take the same poll in China, you probably get the same result. Because that's the basic human reaction to something like what we're saying. So I think very hopeful.
Unfortunately, the collective action is usually followed by dilemma, which is a problem of actually achieving the 90% goal.
Yeah, I just wanted to chip in. I think a lot of lessons can be learned from the GMO debate. And that will shape, I think the key answer to your question is that it will take a multi-layer effort to make sure that CRISPR and gene editing are developed in a responsible way. I was actually quite surprised yesterday. There was one of those polls, which, by the way, I find them quite interesting, that asked to what extent the public debate should inform research. To my extent, it should be to a large extent. But I was surprised that those who answered to a large extent and those who answered not at all were pretty much the same numbers. So most people believed that to some extent the public debate should inform research. While I understand that, of course, we need innovation. We need a lot of research come to things that were not thought in advance. And so we need to have that room for innovation. But at the same time, when we're talking about technologies that have the potential to have a global impact, be it positive or negative, we do need the public to inform research. We do need to take ethical considerations into account. So it will be up for governments to have the regulatory oversight, but also the scientific community will play a key role in shaping that direction. I mean, no one will be able to, the biohackers or those who want to, we heard a lot about that in one of the panels yesterday. The potential for misuse is there. There is no doubt about that. But it also depends on the direction. You cannot give to a total layperson a kit, and that person will not reach a bioweapon on its own. There has to be some research done before that will enable that. And that's where the responsibility of each scientist comes into play. And then of governments. So it's a lot of the multi-layers. It's the society has to be engaged. And that, I think, is the crucial difference from what happened to LMOs. LMOs is the UN language for GMOs. I think that there was a key mistake, if I may, from the industry of not being transparent enough from the beginning, of not saying, yes, there are risks, and we should be looking at those. Everything was fine at the beginning, let's roll out these products and so on, without taking into account the needs. We heard the debate and what's going on in Martha's Vineyard, and I thought that was quite interesting on how they are looking into solutions for their problems. But it's guided, that rollout of that technology is being guided by the community. So to address specific needs, and I think that's what's needed. Yeah. And if we can emulate those experiences at a global scale, I think we're in a good shape.
If I may,
yeah, sure.
I think, when we talk about CRISPR or genome editing, we're talking about a technology. And to regulate a technology across all the different sectors is a really huge ask, right? A lot of these CRISPR genome editing can use in very different ways. So from a regulatory perspective, what's important is the product. And the product, there's so many different products with each product with very different questions, and each product perhaps with different frameworks for discussion, right? So I think for the human application side, from a disease prevention perspective or treatment, it can be a very personal question. So, we have the cultural ethics, but then my personal ethics, right? So how do I determine whether I'm going to use a treatment for my child? How do I even determine that, to use whatever technology in my own personal space? So in that way, you can have a personal opt-out, right? I think on the eco-technology, sure, that's more of a societal one, like Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. You can as personally opt out of that, right? Mosquito control. On agriculture, it's kind of both, right? So at the supermarket, you can opt out of technology. I can say I opt out of whatever, single-use plastics, for example. I can opt out of that. But then, every action we do at the supermarket has some downstream effects towards the farmer. And the farmer can also opt in and opt out. But how do all these interplay? I think in agriculture is a really interesting question. But at the end of the day, it's about application and use, not about the technology. It's about exactly what we're going to do. So from the agriculture perspective, and I can just use one of the examples that was in our lightning round, if you have animals that has a naturally occurring, or I would say artificially selected, because that's what we're doing when we're breeding, characteristic, and you want to move that allele or that change into something that we want to farm and eat, then this technology allows you to do that, right? So do you tell an animal breeder, nah, just do it for 20 years and keep selecting until you get that change, or you use this to accelerate and precisely move that, right? So this is something I think from an agricultural perspective is very different from a human application perspective. The intended use of that animal too is either for food or is it for medicinal purposes. That factors into how I think regulation and should be framed as well. So go ahead.
Oh, well, that's actually a great segue. We're going to go back to the poll questions later, or maybe a little bit, or at least we get I want to discuss some of the things that we talked about we saw in those polls. In terms of, as we look forward to, obviously it's going to be difficult regulating this area. Obviously it's going to be a long series of negotiations on different fronts in different ways. But as we think about this challenge, as we go forward, how are the different issue areas going to play out? We saw in those polls, people had different perceptions about the possibility for regulation or agreement or control on agricultural areas versus environmental areas in the wild versus germline editing, things like that. So I guess on the questions, I'm curious to have the panel give, in effect, answers to the questions that the pollsters were asking, which is, as you look forward, how do you see the likelihood in terms of both importance and feasibility of substantial regulation constructively in the different dimensions of gene editing going forward? And anybody can start out taking it as they want.
Well, it may be worth stepping again a few steps back, because some things have been said about innovation that one might actually want to put side by side with your point that I think people haven't picked up on the question of, or so much as yet, about the individual being able to run away with the technology. So not all innovation is great innovation, and even accidental innovations might let things loose out of these individual garage labs that people celebrate at one level. It used to be that there was a thing called the scientific community, or there were communities of scientists. And the question of responsible research that, Manuela, you raised was partly encoded into the practices of scientists who were doing particular things. I mean, so, you know, around molecular biology, there was a set of understandings. And the Asilomar meeting was actually quite good at laying down those sorts of things in the safety guidelines that emerged out of that meeting. But what we're talking about today is a different culture of innovation, which almost celebrates people not being part of a community and doing, quote, disruptive innovation, unquote, which by its very nature doesn't really tell you what's being disrupted. And you could be disrupting fairly important norms under the name of innovation and only finding out, you know, when an unruly CEO is fired, that that was not really the direction you wanted to go after all, which may be kind of late in the day. I mean, right now, every day we're seeing new headlines about Facebook, for instance, wildly successful company, certainly considered disruptive innovation in the very best sense until maybe day before yesterday. But, you know, now we're having second thoughts about how to manage it and what should have been the right form of regulation. And again, if you look at the newspapers, you find that the regulator-in-chief of Facebook, at least as of today, seems to be Apple. Now, I mean, you know, that is a weird theory and understanding of democracy, right? I mean, you know, what is it that we have a war of billionaires against billionaires to see how industry ought to be regulated? So, you know, I think that one has to recall something about the public sphere. So finally, you spoke about products, for instance. Is a human being whose germline has been engineered a product? Or are we going to think about that human being as a categorically different thing? And if it's a categorically different thing, then is a regulatory structure that was premised on the idea that we only care about products and the risks they pose ever going to be adequate to think about the social, moral, ethical implications of engineering a human being such that the germline carries forward that edited function further on down the line? Now, we've already got, as you pointed out, Duanjing, one report on that coming out of the National Academies of Science in this country. But one could ask, you know, what constituted the committee that wrote that report? Could an observer have predicted what that committee would say? My answer is yes, they could have predicted it. Does that make it a good report, or should there have been, you know, really wide space for dissent around some of the framings and some of the outcomes?
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on the different potential for regulation in different areas?
Well, it had to be general principles that all of us would agree. And that's actually outlined in the report. I'm part of the 22 authors. And also we have to pay respect, special attention to different cultural, political persuasion. You know, you can't be one single, I think. So that's what the report is really intended to. So we hope that the principle outlined there can be adapted by different jurisdictions, maybe 10 or 20 years down the road when they try to draft something to not necessarily regulate, maybe, you know, just set up guidelines. I think initially it will be guidelines, and guidelines has been issued by many, many bodies. You know, for ISCR issued a guideline. I think the Hickston group issued some guidelines. And all those I think are very, very helpful. So I think in the end, I think will be some common principles we have to all agree upon, and also be sensitive to specific issues.
I'm curious, it's a rare opportunity to engage with a high-level Chinese scientist working on these issues, so it's a great opportunity and pleasure. I'm curious, do you see this area, do you worry that this particular area will get sucked into the US-China potential geopolitical competition? We already see AI becoming a kind of quasi-weaponized or a geopolitical race, who's going to control AI. Do you see this kind of area, the collaborative benefit of science, being outweighed by the sort of divided zero-sum aspect of geopolitics?
I'm not a politician, so I can't answer that one, but I can tell from a scientific perspective, I think it will be very difficult for the technology to be balkanized into, it started out as an international effort, and I think dialogue is international in nature. I think it's going to continue to be, I hope, very cooperative.
Thank you.
If I may, I think this is happening already. You asked if we think it's going to happen. I think it's already happening. Behind the scenes, countries have always made agreements, so they disagree, they coordinate their views when they come to the public forum of the UN. That's been happening for every technology or every single aspect of that's being discussed. What I think is different this time is that there is a lot of pressure. There is a lot of pressure of indigenous communities. More than ever, we have a debate now within the CBD. Traditionally, we've always worked on evidence-based approaches, and that has informed the public debate, that has informed governments, but more and more we have traditional knowledge cropping up and saying it's equally important. It's not just evidence-based. You were talking about products, how they label products. Can we label a human as a product? My answer, and this is my personal answer, is absolutely no. Can we label a tree or an animal as a product? I don't think so. For some peoples, even for indigenous peoples, a rock, a river are living entities. So we need to take those into account when we take those, when countries shape their regulations. And so that is the difference, I think, that of the current environment that we are at. So the geopolitics has always been there, but now there are people watching more closely.
Sheila, I'm curious, in the perspective that you have, a long-term, big, broad perspective, does gene editing resemble to you, or does it resemble anything else? What analogies would you spontaneously generate for this kind of technology and its introduction and spread? Is there anything comparable in the history of science? Or what things would you say are comparable?
Well, there are other long durée, as they call it, long duration problems that have not settled. And it seems to me that one should look at the nuclear power being chief among them. That is, in this country, we didn't have a meltdown like Chernobyl, and yet we landed in a de facto moratorium since 3 Mile Island, which was nothing like Fukushima and nothing like Chernobyl. And how should we look at that? So, we decided that we had done something at least very questionable in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that the world should not do it again. So we decided to go after that by saying, okay, we will control the warlike uses of the atom in these ways, but we will go full speed ahead on the peaceful uses. But, I think the world has had a referendum that's gone on for a half century on whether that was an adequately debated set of issues. And there were certain things that were simply not resolved. So I remember the 1980, I think, referendum that Austria had on a nuclear power plant they had already built and were ready to turn the switch, to turn it on. Austria does not have, internal fuel sources, so it was a prime country for nuclear power. And lo and behold, the referendum said, no, don't turn it on. And I was talking to an Austrian lawyer and said, can you explain this to me? What happened? And he said, well, I don't really know, because we had actually solved the waste problem, which is the only real problem. We were going to ship the waste to Egypt. So, the nuclear wastes problem remains an unresolved problem in the United States of America in 2018. Yucca Mountain is considered by some to be the most expensive piece of real estate in the world, because more research dollars have gone into it than into any single piece of territory. So, you can look at the GMOs and the nuclear case as parallels, but as parallels about how we should be thinking, well, what we should not be doing about the nature of the debate. I mean, I think right now we're in a phase of, throw the regulators out, and I don't think people recognize the points that you both have been making, that the regulatory process, for all of its messiness, is a kind of enabling space. It's an incremental space. It's a recursive space. People can come back to it. They can learn. They can revisit the issue. And people think of regulation as this binary thing. You put controls on or you don't put controls on. And they don't take into account that it is about developing a kind of public sphere. If the US pulls back and says, we don't want a public sphere for technology anymore, that is really a sad abdication.
Okay. Yeah.
I think from the agriculture side, and it's kind of, I've never thought about GMOs and nuclear power at the same space before. I think on the agricultural side, there is already international collaboration and discussion, right? Because everyone sees an opportunity to more precisely not to say that there won't be more tools coming down the line to breed. This is something that they've been doing for generations, centuries, is how do we do it better, how to do it better. So I think around the world, there's lots of conversations from both the regulatory space and a research space. And I think when we think about regulation, we always think about commercialization, about product coming, but it also has a lot of impact on cross-border research collaborations. Like, how am I going to move my plasmid across it? If I move a germplasm, is it a GMO? Is it not a GMO? If it's a GMO in your country and not a GMO in my country, there's so many different controls. So we had to think about that as well as we're thinking about regulations, is how we're smoothing the path for international collaboration on the research front, as well on the trade front. But I am pretty hopeful. I'm a pessimistic optimist on global convergence, if not compatibility, in their regulatory processes.
Okay. We have just a very, very short little bit of time left, but I do want to get to some of the questions from the audience. Let me just say, by the way, about the analogy question. There are no perfect analogies, and this is an interesting one. The nuclear one is actually one that came to my mind as well. But I look at it as a security person a little bit different, right? And what we see is a sort of structural feature of the situation emerged in terms of deterrence that actually enabled a sort of calm stability to play out after sort of rules of the road were worked out, which then created a sort of stable structure for half a century or so until other things happened to answer some of the questions while leaving others, like the efficacy of deterrence and so forth, completely unknown in retrospect. But the question will be, there's something like gene editing. Unlike nuclear weapons, the gene editing goes forward in geometric independent ways of its own and spreads out. So it's actually going to be, I'm not sure we'll have the luxury of waiting 50 years to deal with the questions of gene editing and answer some of the questions that we still have with nuclear stuff. But I do know already that my type is going to have to learn biology, just like we learned nuclear physics, for God's sakes. Quickly, how would you communicate, some of the skeptics, what are the legitimate risks of gene editing to the public? How would you communicate those very, very briefly? Who wants to say in 2 sentences what the risks of gene editing are?
I don't think we can.
Okay.
I can do it in 2 sentences. But I think we have to start, rather than through communication, we have to start through dialogue, so a two-way. And what Klaas said yesterday, I thought was very important, is asking the right questions. I think we need, the public sphere needs a place for the public to ask the right questions. And then it's through public participation in decision-making. Many countries have public consultations for before they adopt certain GMOs, but it's very rare that the public truly participates in the decision-making. And I think that needs to change. And that's where risks will be communicated, but also the benefits.
Dr. Jasanoff, you got one of 2 choices. You can either, is the consumer always right? Or what possible ways does CRISPR constrict human possibility?
It's tempting to address both. It should be pointed out that the consumer's opinions are not independent of what's being sold to the consumer, but without going too far down that line, the constricting of human possibility through CRISPR. I mean, one of the sort of fundamental philosophical points to take away is that technology isn't just a thing. Technology is also always societal, it's embedded in society, it's given rise to out of society. So how a technology would constrict human possibility, gene editing, is in the way that it ends up changing our imagination of what kinds of things we are, what kinds of people we are, and quite eminent scientists would agree with me that there's a chance that our ideas of perfectibility, situated as they are in time and space, right now, what do we think is perfectibility, will end up constraining the total span of diversity in the human population in ways that may prove quite detrimental in the long haul.
And Dr. Pei, I'll give you the last word. Is the Chinese-US spat over intellectual property issues affecting anything in terms of technology sharing or scientific working?
I think in the future, when these two countries sort of reach a point where you have, parity, put it equal in terms of how much you have, how much I have, I think that's probably the time we all agree on something we're going to share.
May I have the last
Yes.
word? I want the last word. I think, when
You have the last one.
I think when we talk about risk, what's the legitimate risk? We've been thinking about environmental risk. We've been thinking about human health risk. We've been thinking about all these kind of negative risk. But I think we also need to think about what is the risk of not doing it. So we think both about the risk of doing it, but we also need to think about the risk of not doing it. So that would be my last
Absolutely. And on that note, thank all of you, thank our panelists, and
Thank
to be
you.
continued. Wonderful talk.
Well said.